have it today. And the next part is to introduce the speaker, which is me. So I'm going to skip that. So I'm going to skip that, and I think let's talk about the format, although I'm going to say a little about the idea of having the book lovers club. It so happened that when I was attending the Socrates Cafe, I found out that a lot of people are so passionate about the books they read and they want to talk about it. And I thought, hey, this is a great idea. And I had a selfish thing in it that I could find out about books from people who think alike instead of going to the New York Times bestseller and this bestseller and that bestseller. The best is to learn it from your own ilk, to say. And that's how this whole idea came to be. So I think the way we will do is that whoever wants to do that, we will start from this side. And again, we will pick 2 people from the room and then 2 from the Zoom, okay? So the idea is you can say your name, whatever introduction you want to give. Maybe you want to talk a little bit, like a couple statements about, sentences about your relationship with the book, how you fell in love with reading, whatever. And then talk about a particular book, maybe a genre, a particular writer's books. And if you have something to read from that book, great. So start with that. Start with you, Jen.
I'll come back later.
Sure.
Anyone else, I have the microphone.
Can I start?
Okay. Yeah, I was thinking we will go like this, so
I'm
whoever
sorry.
goes from here first.
I guess
Okay,
I'm next.
sure.
You
Okay.
are.
Yes, 2 here and 2 Zoom. We'll follow the same pattern. Yeah.
You want me to sit here or?
I think you can sit there, right, Eric? She can be sitting. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Okay,
Just hold the mic close.
easier to read
For the Zoom.
with this down a little bit.
Yeah.
It's hard.
That's okay.
Okay, probably starting with Janet Glass's sessions on being white. I started reading a number of books on.
Can you say your name, please? Just
Can you
say your
hear
name.
me now?
Yes.
Okay, good. I started reading a number of books that she recommended and whatever, and currently reading one that is so good that when I saw what our topic was today, I had to bring it with me. It's by Eric Holder, who was Attorney General under Obama. It's called Our Unfinished March, and I would like to read some things in here. Okay. I think is that okay? I think I can hold it close, but thank you for trying. Okay. It's just a few pages, but I just was so impressed with it. This is about Reconstruction, which took place after the Civil War. He says, if you're from my generation, basically everything you were taught about Reconstruction was wrong, and that was intentional. I bet you, like me, were told that it didn't work, that the North was too slow to welcome the South back to the Union, that Republicans advocating for universal suffrage were radical, that the African Americans who were elected after the Civil War were incompetent to the extent that they were mentioned at all. And that's because for half a century, members of the press and historians were committed to promulgating that narrative. These lost cause propagandists called African American legislatures monkey houses. They lied about whether African Americans in Congress could read and claimed falsely that they didn't pay their taxes. In some cases, the names of black officials weren't even included in public records because, as one Democrat wrote, and the Democrats were the bad guys in those days, it would be absurd to record the lives of men who were but yesterday our slaves. In D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a Nation, one of the early 20th century's highest-grossing films, black elected officials during Reconstruction were portrayed as alcoholics who drank on the floor of Congress. It was nothing short of a coordinated attempt to erase the period in American history when our country saw the beginnings of a multiracial democracy, when, as W.E.B. Du Bois wrote, the slave, when free, stood a brief moment in the sun that moved back again toward slavery. I'd like to keep going if that's okay. But in recent decades, a new generation of historians, building on the work of Du Bois' groundbreaking Black Reconstruction, and led by Eric Foner, who was one of our ethical culture speakers, Eric Foner, my former professor at Columbia, have looked back on Reconstruction and discovered a fundamentally different story, the true one, a story at once more brutal and more hopeful than the one most of us were taught growing up. The years following the Civil War were indeed full of bloodshed, defined in no small part by the rise of white supremacists, the growth of the Ku Klux Klan, and the macabre massacres these racists perpetrated. But these years also opened up America's eyes to the possibility of making the vision of a multiracial democracy a reality, and in so many ways, Reconstruction was a success. In just over a decade following the end of the Civil War, close to 2,000 African Americans held elected office, serving in city halls, governor's mansions, and even Congress. They were black mayors, black sheriffs, black senators, and they used that power to make a difference, persisting in the face of death threats, to advocate for workers, reform the criminal justice system, and most important, increase access to education. As Du Bois wrote, the first great mass movement for public education at the expense of the state in the South came from Negroes. It paid off. Within years, public school enrollment among black Americans skyrocketed from 91,000 to 572,000 as illiteracy was cut almost in half, and poor whites benefited from this expansion to the social safety net as well. Keep going a little more.
Yeah, a little bit. Why not?
Through reforms like these, black Americans proved that the outcome of the Civil War wasn't meaningful only because it brought an end to the institution of slavery. It was also meaningful because it helped America realize its promise as a democracy and demonstrated that government can be a force for positive change when it reflects the will of all the people. Of course, the story of Reconstruction doesn't have a happy ending. Eventually, the rebirth of American democracy was aborted as lynchings in the South and abandonment by the North allowed white supremacy to once again rule the land. But this doesn't mean that what happened in America in the years following the Civil War didn't matter. To the contrary, it couldn't be more important. That's because Reconstruction, perhaps more than any other period in the history of America, is proof that the moral arc of the universe isn't truly predestined to bend in any one direction. Our country moves forward and backward. We grant rights and then take them away. If you don't hold on to the progress you've made, if you don't remain vigilant in defending it, it will be reversed. That is the lesson of Reconstruction, and as we are faced with a new wave of attacks on our democracy, the only question is whether we will repeat the mistakes of our past or learn from them.
That's beautiful.
Thank you. Thank you.
There's more, and it's absolutely amazing.
Who wants to go next this way?
Anybody else have
I could go.
Okay, well,
We're talking about the books that we like.
yes,
Sure.
hold it
Yeah,
up close.
yeah, absolutely.
Okay. I have a book that I really love. I don't know if I've read it once, twice, or three times. It's called Provence, A Year in Provence. And of course, it's the lifestyle of the Provence people and the sharing of food and the sharing of just everyday life, and shows their lifestyle. So it's really very cozy. It's a cozy book. This guy is talking to that guy, sorry, and they have to bring their table into the yard. It doesn't fit through it's a little comical too. The table didn't fit through the fence, so they had to take it apart. And of course, that was a total fiasco because nobody knew how to do it. So it's a very darling book, and I definitely would recommend it to anybody, especially if you're a Francophile.
Oh, what?
I made that up. Is that true?
Yeah, good word.
Yeah, that's a great
Good
word.
word.
It means
Now we'll
somebody
go.
who loves France.
Yeah, French,
Who loves
France,
or
Frank.
Oh, I get it. No.
Now we'll turn to the Zoom.
Teresa, you have your hand up?
Hi, thank you. The book that I want to recommend is The Beauty of Dusk. I don't know if I'm getting a reversal on that, but it's The Beauty of Dusk by Frank Bruni. Frank Bruni used to be a full-time New York Times columnist, and 5 years ago, he woke up one day with blurry vision. And it turned out that he had a stroke, a rare stroke that obliterated the optic nerve in one of his eyes. So, of course, a lot of treatment followed, a lot of soul searching, but what Frank Bruni's main message in this book is making of hardship something positive. You know, Frank Bruni occasionally still writes for the New York Times, but he left the New York Times to become a professor because it was easier on his eyes. But he says a hardship like this really is not something to wring your hands over so much as it is a puzzle to be solved. And I have a short excerpt that kind of shows you the tone of the book and his conclusions. I wondered if hardship could be an invitation to a deeper kind of living, a prompt for fresh connections and new kinships, a force multiplier for a humanity that too often gets buried under the jumble of a life untouched by significant turmoil. I wondered about vulnerability, whether it came earlier in life because of affliction or later in life because of age. Was it perhaps a portal and a bridge? The Beauty of Dusk by Frank Bruni. Thank you.
That was wonderful. One more person from Zoom.
Nobody else has their hand up in Zoom.
Okay.
I think David does.
Oh, there's David does. You do. Sorry.
Yep, I do. Yeah, I actually want to talk about, believe it or not, 5 books, but they all have a common theme, and I won't spend too much time on each individually. The theme for the first 4 is all COVID. I started reading books about COVID, and I have 3 wonderful books I can recommend, and one that was interesting, though I don't necessarily recommend it, but one of the ones I really recommend is by a science writer named David Quammen, who is a very well-known science writer. He's written a lot of books. And he wrote a book called Breathless, The Scientific Race to Defeat a Deadly Virus. And this book is about the scientific efforts to defeat the virus. It's not really about the Trump era politics of the pandemic. And he goes very deeply into the origins of the virus, how the pandemic first manifested itself. And of course, the development of the mRNA vaccines, as well as some of the other vaccines. And the last chapters, he goes into great detail about the efforts to determine the origins of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And he really summarizes the recent evidence in the past 6 months to a year, which pretty clearly show that it had a natural origin. The scientific consensus has really grown around that point of view. And Quammen, I have to say, is a writer's writer. He really knows how to tell the scientific story as a story, not just as a succession of events, not just a bunch of facts. He's a wonderful writer. He's written many books, and I've read other books by him, and I really strongly recommend it. Now, another book is called Preventable: The Inside Story of How Leadership Failures, Politics, and Selfishness Doomed the US Coronavirus Response. And as you can imagine from the title, that is all about the failures of the Trump administration. And it's written by Andy Slavitt. I'd known the name, but not really known who he was. He was the acting administrator for the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services from 2015 to 2017. And he was a temporary senior advisor to the COVID-19 response team in the Biden administration. And perhaps most importantly, he led the team that fixed healthcare.gov. That was the disastrous rollout of Obamacare. You may remember it was a catastrophic rollout. The computer system failed. It crashed all the time. He led the effort to straighten that out. So he has a lot of credibility in this area. And he really goes into great detail about all the failures, many of which we're already familiar with, but it's still very interesting going over it. It is, of course, a very sad story, but he's a pretty good writer himself. And I recommend that book also. Now, another book that I recommend is called The Premonition, a Pandemic Story. And this is by Michael Lewis. And probably if any of you know who Michael Lewis is, it's from Liar's Poker, which he wrote and which was a huge bestseller, and also The Big Short, which was a bestseller made into a terrific movie. And this book is not a screed about the failures of the Trump administration. Instead, it's a story about the failures of the public health systems in America. And I use the word systems, plural, because in America, there is no public health system. Each state is responsible for its own public health system, and each locality has their own as well. And he really has a lot to say about the terrible failures of public health in America, and talking not just about COVID, but about other communicable diseases like tuberculosis, which is still a big problem in America and in the rest of the world. And he too is a wonderful writer. He knows how to tell a story, and he tells these stories through individuals. In particular, a public health officer from San Bernardino, California, and she has her name is Charity. I think her last name is Green. I can't remember it now. But she has a terrific story, and I really can't recommend this book enough. And finally, I read Deborah Birx's book. Now, you all know Deborah Birx. She's a phenomenal public servant, a real hero in public health in America. She did a great deal to help with the AIDS epidemic. She wrote a memoir called Silent Invasion, The Untold Story of the Trump Administration, COVID-19, and Preventing the Next Pandemic Before It's Too Late. It's very interesting, but the problem is she's not really a writer. She could have used a co-author who was a writer, to be honest. It's her story. I would recommend reading it, but I would recommend it last among the books I've mentioned. She tells the story as a succession of events. We did this, then we did this, then we did that. A lot of very interesting stuff, but she's not a real writer. And I want to mention one more book, the fifth book, also by Raman, but it's not about COVID. It's about something highly related, and that is the evolution of microbes like viruses and single-cell organisms like bacteria. It's called The Tangled Tree, A Radical New History of Life. Now, I thought I knew a lot about biology and about evolution, but I really didn't know about this because he's telling the story about how genes can be transferred from, and this book was written in 2018, by the way, before the COVID pandemic. He tells a story about how genes can be transferred from one organism to another, not by traditional Darwinian natural selection. The genes are actually transferred from one organism to another. And indeed, how the genetic material from one organism can invade and actually be captured by another and come to carry out critical activities necessary for the life of the host. So you may remember from your high school biology classes, things like mitochondria, which provide energy to the host. Mitochondria are actually captured genetic DNA that the cells have captured from other organisms and put to good use. And in case you might think this has nothing to do with humans, here is an astounding statistic. As much as 8% of the human genome is composed of genetic sequences that are of viral origin. That is to say, at some point in our long history, our ancestors were infected by a virus, probably a retrovirus, and that those viruses were incorporated into our germline and exist and transmitted down to our descendants and exist in us and perform important functions for us. I find that an astonishing thing. So those are the books I've been reading lately.
There is a request that all people on Zoom, can you please list your books on the chat? That will be good. Okay.
Okay. I think we're back to the meeting
Very
house
good.
now.
Okay, I think I want to repeat it. Like people on Zoom chat, can you please list your books that you talked about or you're going to talk on the Zoom chat?
I will.
Okay, everybody here. Okay. Now we'll go to two more people from the room. Yeah. Who is next? Pan. Yeah.
Pam's been.
Pan. Yeah, sorry.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. Well, I'm not as fond of nonfiction as I am of fiction. And the reason that I love today is because I actually created a book club at the Senior Center in Fair Lawn. And what we do is I choose a book that has a movie that goes along with it.
Great.
So, and there are lots and lots of books out there with movies. So I decided for this month, we were going to do an exciting book and movie that I only saw the movie for. I don't know if anybody remembers the author Tom Clancy. Yes. He wrote a book called A Clear and Present Danger. And I loved the movie. It was really exciting with Harrison Ford. But I am reading the book now, and it is 100% better than the movie.
Of course. What a surprise.
Now, the crux of, I'm going to read a small sample of the excitement that it creates. But the crux of the story is the drug cartels are trying to overtake everything. And they're growing larger and larger and larger. And the President of the United States has decided to declare war on the drug cartels. Only it doesn't work as well as they think it's going to work. Because what happens is a ship is spotted in the Bahamas, and it was overtaken by two assassins, and they kill an American and his family. And the Coast Guard comes in and finds the murderous event. They see the blood, they see the rape, they see everything that's occurred. And the two men who created the havoc are still on the ship. So what they do is they are fed up when they see this. They're really upset because it's too graphic for them. And the captain of the ship wants to see them punished. So he pretends to create a trial on board. And that's where the excitement begins, because one small event disturbed the whole entire line of events to come. And instead of it just being handled like a normal investigation, created a lot of other deaths and a lot of excitement. So I'm going to read just the ship courtroom, and hold on a second. Sorry. Technical difficulties here. Come on, sweetheart, you got a date with the rope. The Master Chief led him out of the room. He's saying this to one of the two criminals. The other prisoner, known as James Doe, had watched the entire proceeding in fascinated disbelief. This disbelief was still there. Everyone saw, but it was more the sort of disbelief that you'd expect to see on the face of a man stuck in front of an onrushing train. "Do you understand what's going on here?" asked the lieutenant. That ain't real, man, the prisoner said, his voice lacking much of a conviction it might have held an hour or so earlier. He still can't believe that this is happening to them. Hey, man, aren't you paying attention? Didn't they tell you guys that some of your kind just sort of disappear out here? We've been doing this for almost 6 months. The prisons are full up, and the judges don't want to be bothered. If we bag somebody and we have the evidence we need, they let us handle things at sea, which is a total lie, of course. Didn't anybody tell you that the rules have changed some? You can't do this, he almost screamed in reply. Think so? Tell you what, in about 10 minutes, I'll take you topside and you can watch. I'm telling you, if you don't cooperate, we are not going to F around with you, pal. We're tired of that. Why don't you just sit quiet and think it over, and when the time comes, I'll let you see how serious we are. The lieutenant helped himself to a cup of coffee to pass the time, not speaking at all to his client. About the time he finished, the door opened again. Hands topside to witness punishment, Chief Orteza announced. Come on, Mr. Doe. You better see this. The lieutenant took him by the arm and led him forward. Just outside the wardroom door was a ladder that led upward. At the top of it was a narrow passageway, and both men headed aft towards the cutter's vacant helicopter deck. The lieutenant's name was Rick Allison, a black kid from Albany, New York, and the ship's navigator Allison thanked God every night for serving under Red Wagner, that's the captain, who was far and away the best commander he'd ever met. Now we're going to skip to actually where he's looking at his friend being hung.
Oh,
But
okay.
which, am I short on time?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Anyway, you really, really need to read the book. It's exciting. I will say there are some parts that are hard to read because I don't know anything about jet aviations and fighters and stuff. But excellent, excellent book. Thank you.
Who wants to go next?
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
Thanks. I'm always surprised at how I just bump into a book. I mean, I listen to a lot of trash, basically, while I'm on an audiobook stream and while I'm doing my housework. But every once in a while, I'll bump into a book where I can't put it down. I'm staying up late after my husband goes to bed so I can get another chapter in. And this was one of them. Will in the World by Stephen Greenblatt. I think my brain was a little turned on to the idea that we're doing the skills auction again, which had a Shakespeare theme. And we've both been big fans of this British satirical sitcom called Upstart Crow. So I wanted to read some real history about Shakespeare, and we were in a real genuine bookstore when we were visiting in Virginia. And there they had a whole shelf of Shakespeare goodies. So this was sitting there, $6. Oh my God, I couldn't believe it, because it was published a little while ago. Stephen Greenblatt is a professor of the humanities at Harvard University. He's deep scholarship expert on the Elizabethan era in England, the Renaissance in general. He's written magnificent scholarly works, but he had a bee in his bonnet about bringing Shakespeare to the masses, like me. And he actually was an advisor on the film Shakespeare in Love. He's willing to mingle with movies. So there's not that much actual stuff directly connected to Shakespeare. That's the maddening thing. There are the plays, And there's a few legal documents and tidbits, but compared to other authors from this period and other figures in Elizabethan life, there's a real paucity of factual information. So how does he get these wonderful insights into what was probably going on in Shakespeare's mind when he wrote his great and enduring dramas, besides the fact that he was a genius who just came along at a crucial moment in English culture and language and playmaking. You triangulate. If you know tons about the day-to-day history of the City of London, of the other playwrights operating, the atmosphere of politics and conspiracy and distaste or, difficulty if you had any kind of sensibility for the old religion, Catholicism, in the modern, new Protestant religion, he knows how to weave all of these elements into finding what's going on that gives you a key into the plays. There was a huge conspiracy of Elizabeth's advisors to find a villain at a crucial point in her administration to cover up their malfeasance. So they picked on her physician, who was a closeted Jew from Spain, who was a very competent physician, but they decided to make him the enemy, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, and that was all roiling through London, and Ruiz was executed horribly. And guess what? Shakespeare writes a very bold play, The Merchant of Venice, featuring a pretty dark character, the Jewish moneylender, but with so many touches of humanity to that character that it is possible for us to still have that play in the repertory today. So just those kinds of historic knowledge that, 10 feet deep into Elizabethan culture lets Greenblatt understand the plays very deeply and also talk to us about it in wonderful, clear language. So there's Stephen Greenblatt. Here's the image he chose for Shakespeare on his cover, this smart guy working in London. So I couldn't put this book down. I really recommend it. Read it for the skills auction.
Okay. We can turn to Zoom now.
Yeah, I think Joelle, you're next.
Sorry. Can you?
Okay, hi. I think when I read, my face will go away because I'm on my phone. Sorry about that. So I want to talk about a few different books. I listened to Martin Luther King Jr.'s autobiography in spring on an audiobook. Slowly, took me a long time to work through it. It's a lot of obviously heavy historical events covered, and his speeches, some of the live recordings are included, which is just spectacular, and just gaining a new appreciation for what an intellectual individual he was and how deeply he researched his points and his philosophy of nonviolent resistance. It was just incredible. And especially, there's a lot of people who passed away during the civil rights struggle, and he was speaking sometimes at funerals. And one of the most wonderful things that stuck with me is, he was speaking about how the struggle must continue and it must be larger than ourselves, even if you don't get to see the outcome of what you're fighting for and striving for a better world, and he gave a lot of examples like Gandhi, who never got to see the world he envisioned and in fact saw the opposite happening, things like that. And it was just so much more powerful and encouraging than I realized. And I was just like, wow, what a gift he was. And what kind of world or country would we have if we still had him? What kind of difference would he have continued to make? And how can, all of us really find that deep, true calling and dedication to truth and justice is just wonderful. and perseverance despite just horrible things happening all the time around us. And so I actually didn't have that written down, but some of the other two books that I want to recommend, I had written things about in the past. So I want to mention those. Let me see if I can pull it up correctly. I had it. I think I lost it. Sorry. I was pulling up all the Goodreads books that you guys were mentioning as in lifetime. So one of them is called The Deepest Well, Healing the Impacts of Childhood Adversity. And it talks about how stress so deeply impacts us in ways we are just beginning to understand. Like the book starts very dramatically with an example of a man who has a good job, a good family, seems healthy, everything seems completely fine. And then all of a sudden he has no risk factors for a heart attack. And all of a sudden he has one. And it's a shock to everyone. And how those kind of health outcomes are tied back to these adverse childhood experiences called ACE score. So that sets you up for poorer health outcomes, even if you manage to overcome your adverse childhood experiences, and it's in your body. And so that is really fascinating. And it goes to the other example extreme of a child who is not growing properly because of stress in their childhood. And they're, they have food available, but they're just not, their body can't process it. And so they're extremely small and underweight. And then, other children who have reactions of getting into harmful self-destructive behaviors, and how do we actually help them and help all of us. And it's just a really hopeful book. I have a little note saved on my phone about the ways to overcome toxic stress, and the top 5, actually 6, is sleep, exercise, nutrition, mindfulness, mental health, and healthy relationships. I personally added nature and music and art. But yes, so thank you for being part of the healthy relationships for me, guys. And then the last book I want to mention is called The Lady's Handbook to Her Mysterious Illness. I think I've done a bad job of naming the authors. I put them in the chat though. So this book I read when I was trying to figure out some health problems, and it turned out wasn't necessarily giving me the answers, but it was so fascinating. It talks about how women's health problems are ignored. Their valid concerns and suffering are swept under the rug and stigmatized. There's still a huge, you're just hysterical type of behavior with sexism in the medical industry. And it's actually, they compared it to what happened in the early days of denial of the AIDS epidemic. So women's health concerns are being ignored and trivialized. And so that's actually a huge widespread problem. And women are trained to just suck it up and not complain. And, another thing that I thought was so interesting is that women have such a larger tendency to have autoimmune diseases. And because their complaints are swept under the rug, those diseases have not been researched as much. They're not considered as glamorous as cancer or heart disease and all these other things. So yeah, really interesting. And I think almost every woman I've mentioned it to is like, wow, that's me. I have totally experienced that. So I really like to mention it to everyone, for the woman you care in your life, if you are not a woman, or, for yourselves or whatever. So that's it for me.
Thank you, Joelle. I think there's anybody else from the Zoom land.
Okay, so here, anyone on this side? Okay, great.
Okay. I'd like to talk about a book I haven't read yet. It's on order, but like a lot of books, my interest in it, pardon me, has been sparked by seeing something either in the movies or on television. And I tend to love books that are about the process of building monumental things. I loved David McCulloch's book, The Great Bridge, about the construction of the Brooklyn Bridge and the political forces and social forces that both stood as an impediment to it and a requirement that it be built. And along comes another one that I saw a documentary about. In 1421, a grand new cathedral had been under construction in Florence for over a century, and it came time to put a dome on this building, and it hadn't been designed yet, and nobody had any idea how to build a dome that high off the ground that wouldn't collapse of its own weight. So they held pardon me, they held a competition, and a guy by the name of Filippo Brunelleschi came forward with an idea that he got apparently from the properties of an eggshell. And the book that I have on order by Ross King details the construction of this dome within the context and the framework of the society in 15th century Florence. I can't wait to get my hands on it. It's a promising book. So Ross King, Brunelleschi's Dome. I've recommended it to myself, and I'm recommending it to you.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay. Do we have time for a couple more, Eric? I don't know.
Sure, we have time.
Okay, sure. So, anyone done?
Okay.
Done. Thank you.
So I'm going to recommend. Can you hear me through the mask, or should I take it off?
No. Very well.
I'm going to recommend two books.
Nobody's even near you.
I'm going to recommend two books. So, Woody Guthrie did not serve in the Army during World War II, but he shipped out in the Merchant Marine. And he shipped out with his folk singing buddy Cisco Houston, who's not quite as well known as Woody, except among folk music aficionados. And with a third guy, an Italian-American New Yorker named Jim Longhi. Jim Longhi came from a left-wing Italian family, grew up in that milieu. And the three of them shipped out 3 times in the Merchant Marine, shipping to Europe on Liberty ships that carried troops from the U.S. to Europe. Well, Jim Longhi wrote a memoir of their journeys. It's called Woody, Cisco, and Me. And it is absolutely wonderful, both because of what it tells about Woody and Cisco and what life was like on these Liberty ships, and the sometimes horrifying and sometimes hilarious episodes that they went through. Jim Longhi actually was an attorney. He was trained as a lawyer, but that didn't stop him from shipping out with Woody and Cisco and doing some of the dirtiest jobs out there, and writing about them brilliantly, and writing about some of the outrageous ways that the three of them, typically with Woody taking the lead, were able to break the rules in ways that were good. For instance, on their last trip, everything was, the soldiers were all strictly segregated, and the crews were strictly segregated. And one time, and these ships, by the way, were under the constant threat of being destroyed by Nazi U-boats. I mean, you know, these were dangerous crossings. And one time they're crossing, and a bunch of the black crew were singing. The only place they could sing was in the black toilets. The toilets were segregated too. And Woody comes and joins them, which of course was already totally against the rules. And of course the best music is going on over there as they're swapping stuff, and everybody else wants to hear it. And Woody manages, well, and Jim Longhi helps, for that one part of their journey, to integrate the music on that ship, going against every military regulation that was in effect. And Jim Longhi writes about it brilliantly. It's too long a passage to read. But the whole book is just one great thing after another. And as I say, it can be hilarious, it can be incredibly moving, and everything in between. The other book that I want to talk about is by Michael Wex. And Michael Wex is a Canadian Jewish writer, one of the world's great experts on Yiddish, and not only Yiddish language, but the culture that goes with it. And he wrote a book called How to Be a Mensch and Not a Schmuck.
That's a good one.
Now, and actually, it may be one of the most closely argued books on ethics that I know. I don't even agree with all of it, but it's brilliantly argued. He draws on everything from Yiddish folk sayings to Talmudic argument. And some of it you probably have to know a little bit of that as background to follow what he's doing. But some of it you don't, and a lot of it you don't. And for instance, he has a whole thing on why the negative form of the golden rule, the one that says, do not do unto others as you would not have them do unto you, is much better than the positive form of the golden rule, the one that says, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Because it's much easier to imagine what you don't want somebody to do to you. It's really hard to put yourself into the frame of mind of what would you want and assume that somebody else would want the same thing. And I'm greatly simplifying an argument that he makes, but he's brilliant. And as I say, he draws on a lot of things. The last section of the book, he actually points to two movies that talk about how people transform from schmucks to Menschen. Menschen is the Yiddish plural of Mensch. One of them we've seen here, actually, courtesy of David, and that was, I'm forgetting the name of the movie, The Apartment. And the other one, and the last one that he mentions, is Groundhog Day, which I haven't seen, by the way. And that's actually the end of the book, when he talks about how the guy in Groundhog Day moves from being a schmuck to being a mensch. It's a brilliant book, and as I say, to have somebody who's drawing on folk traditions and quoting things, do a very, very closely argued book on ethics, is kind of remarkable. And as I say, even where I disagree with him, I think he's brilliant and thoughtful. So, two books that I am recommending.
I have a joke about schmuck and a shamil.
Sure.
You have a joke about a schmuck and a schmeal?
I do. What's the difference between a schmuck and a shamil? The schmuck is the one who falls out the window, and the
Go on, and then I'll tell you you're telling it wrong.
and the shamil is the one who gets landed on.
Because it's the difference not between a schmuck and a schmeal, it's the difference between a schlemiel and a schlemazel.
Oh.
So the schlemiel is kind of the ne'er-do-well who, through no fault of his own, can never quite do things right, and the schlemazel is the one who always falls into bad luck, who's sort of even more passive. And so the schlemiel is the one who falls out the window, and the schlemazel is the one who gets fallen on.
Remember that those comedian women
I think we're done.
they used to penny somebody on television, and she used to sing the song about Shlemiel, Shlemazel. Do you remember that, anybody? Laverne and Shirley. Yeah, and they would sing about Shlemiel and Shlemazel, and they would do a little dance to it. It was very adorable.
I just want to add one thing, if I may, to Dan's description of the Liberty ships. They were very dangerous, not only because of German U-boats. My father was an employee at the New York Shipbuilding Corporation during World War II in the Delaware River between Philadelphia and Camden. And he worked on Liberty ships, and he described them to me. You can recognize a Liberty ship because what's called the shear line, which is the line of the hull as it goes from the stern up to the bow on most ships, rises toward the bow in a part of the ship that's known as the forecastle or the forecastle. And on a Liberty ship, these ships were built so quickly and under such exigent circumstances during the war that they had to get them out of the yard and onto the line as fast as possible and as cheaply as possible. So they dispensed with the part of the hull known as the forecastle. And the function of that part basically is to prevent waves from washing over the bow of the boat and swamping the boat and sinking it without any activity on the part of U-boats or anything like that. But it was a calculated risk. They needed these ships in a hurry, they needed them cheap, and they were intended to essentially be as disposable as the men who were on them. And so these ships were built without forecastles. That's just an interesting fact about Liberty ships. So I thought I'd add that.
Sure. Yeah, I think now with that we are out of time for the book lovers. So I think we'll go for the ushers for the collection.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And it's time to thank everybody who did this platform. So today's greeters and ushers are Elaine and Dan. Zoom coordinator was Greg Gordon. Thanks to the Zoom coordinator, hybrid sound engineer Eric Sandhusen, and our Sunday morning social Pam and Susan Leish. Thank you everybody, and special thanks from me because I got for that now I can probably read all these books for the next 1 year. It will keep me busy.
Thank you, Anu. That was wonderful.
Thank you very much.
In case anyone wants, I have
Sure.
a couple of my volunteers.